Reports from Russia's state news agency says that safety systems have been activated at the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant in southeast Ukraine after a power supply failure across the Russian-controlled region. Outages also have been reported in the Kherson region. Russia's defense ministry is claiming that Ukraine has been shelling the plant, which is Europe's largest nuclear power facility. I spoke to our correspondent Hugo Bachega in Kyiv for the very latest. Have a listen.
It's incredibly hard to verify all those claims and counterclaims because this nuclear power plant has been under Russian occupation since the beginning of March, even though Ukrainian technicians are still operating it. And for weeks, Russia and Ukraine have been trading accusations about who is to blame for shelling the complex. The Ukrainians have accused the Russians of essentially turning this nuclear facility into a military base, using it to launch attacks against Ukrainian targets, perhaps knowing that Ukrainian soldiers are unlikely to retaliate. Now, the Russians reject those accusations and they say Russian troops are there protecting this nuclear facility. Now, obviously, this level of military activity around a nuclear power plant has raised fears of a catastrophe. There have been calls for international monitors to be allowed into this complex. And I spoke to the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, when he was here last week, and he told me that it was essential to allow international inspectors into this nuclear facility. The head of the UN's nuclear watchdog said earlier this week that a visit was likely to happen within days, but we haven't had any confirmation about when a visit is going to take place.
Hugo, I want to also turn your attention to another development. We're getting reports, or Russian state media is reporting, that Moscow was behind an airstrike in the east of Ukraine, and Kyiv says 25 people were killed in that.
Yeah, some dramatic details coming from this small town, Chaplin, in the east of the country. It seems that it's the deadliest attack on civilians in weeks. Ukraine says Russian missiles struck a residential area, a train station in this town, and the Ukrainian foreign minister describing it as an act of terrorism. And the US Secretary of State said this attack fits a pattern of atrocities, in his words. But Russia today said a missile struck a military facility at this train station, and the Russian Defense Ministry said 200 Ukrainian soldiers were killed. Now, this happened yesterday as Ukraine marked Independence Day. The country was on high alert because of fears that Russia could use the occasion to launch attacks against Ukrainian cities. That was the case in several cities and towns. Reports of shelling yesterday in the city of Kharkiv in the east, also in the towns of Mykolaiv and Nikopol in the south, which have been under constant Russian attacks in recent weeks. And here in Kyiv, there were no reports of incidents, but a ban on public gatherings continues today.
That was Hugo Bachega reporting there from Kyiv. For more now, I'm joined by Matthew Kronig from the Atlantic Council in Washington. Thank you so much, Mr. Kronig, for joining us here on the programme. I want to shift your attention to the other news and development coming out of Ukraine today, the safety systems that have been activated in Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant in Ukraine after reports that a power supply failure in the region. How concerned should we be? How dangerous is this?
Well, it's very dangerous, and the worst case situation would be something like what we saw in Fukushima in Japan 10 years ago, where you had a nuclear meltdown. The radioactive fuel there literally melted down and got into the soil, the water supply, and caused a ecological disaster. And so something similar could happen at Zaporizhzhia if these cooling systems and the power that supplies the cooling system fails. So it's potentially very dangerous indeed.
For the people in the region, or I mean, what I mean is in the region of Zaporizhzhia, or is this something that could be almost like a Chernobyl 2.0?
Well, I think Fukushima is the better example. And Zaporizhzhia, like many power plants, is on a river. You need the water supply as a coolant. And so if there were a meltdown, then you could have this radioactive material getting into the soil, getting into the river, getting into the water supply. So most dangerous to people nearby, but the effects of this radioactivity can travel quite far. In fact, during Fukushima, there were traces picked up in California from water coming across the Pacific Ocean.
I mean, the fact remains that this power plant has been on the front line virtually from the very beginning of this conflict.
Well, I think it's a good example of Russia's irresponsible behavior in this war. We've seen the war crimes, and this is a good example. Occupying a nuclear power plant, I think it's essentially making it impossible for the Ukrainians to attack Russian forces there for fear of damaging the plant. Russia is essentially using it as a nuclear terror threat, making us in the world worry about a nuclear catastrophe. And then in addition, they could cut off the energy supplies to Ukraine, or maybe even take the energy supplies from this power plant and reroute them into Russia. So really sinister, I think, motives from Russia for occupying this plant for all of these reasons.
Plausible is that, Matthew? Because we are hearing about these plans rather to sabotage, to reroute, as you say. I mean, is that even possible to do?
Well, two things. One, if Russia wanted to intentionally cause a nuclear catastrophe, it would be pretty easy to do that. And so, so far they haven't, which is good news. If they did want to cut off the supply to Ukraine, that would be easy to do. This is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. Ukraine does get a lot of its power from nuclear power, and so that could be devastating to the Ukrainian economy. And then the Russians, while they have some weaknesses, as we're all seeing, they have been a nuclear power since 1949. They are technically proficient, and so if they did want to connect this power plant to their own power lines, to their own energy grid, it wouldn't be easy, but it is something that they could do, essentially stealing energy and wealth from the Ukrainian people.
We continue to hear that Russia is agreeing or has agreed to demilitarize the area, but should we be taking that with a pinch of salt at this point?
I think more than a pinch. We've seen over the years, but especially in this war, that we can't take Russia at its word. It's made all kinds of statements and promises that haven't turned out to be true. And so they continue to occupy this plant. There have been calls from the International Atomic Energy Agency and others to gain access to the plant. But with this heavy Russian military presence there, with the fighting that continues, getting that kind of outside aid there is essentially impossible.
Matthew Kronig from the Atlantic Council, thank you so much for joining us.